They were once lawmen, turned outlaws.
The Dalton Gang feared, hunted, and reckless rode into history with one final,
disastrous act of desperation.
On the morning of October 5, 1892, the Dalton brothers and their gang made
a bold decision,
robbed banks at once in the heart of Coffeyville, Kansas, their own hometown. What they didn't expect was that the town would fight back. This is the true story of the Daltons Last Raid, a dramatic shootout that ended a criminal legacy in a blaze of bullets and blood, a moment frozen in time, captured in newspapers, photographs, and legends.
A failed heist that became the Wild West's final tragic exclamation point. Before they were legends, the Dalton brothers were just that, brothers.
Born into a large family in Kansas, the Daltons grew up poor but proud,
toughened by the demands of frontier life. The most well-known were Grattan Grat Dalton,
Bob Dalton,
Emmett Dalton.
The Daltons weren't always outlaws. In fact, they initially followed in the footsteps of their older brother, Frank Dalton, a respected deputy, U.S. Marshal, but Frank's violent death in the line of duty in 1887 marked a turning point. The grief hardened them, and by the early 1890s,
the remaining Daltons had turned away from the badge
and toward the barrel of a gun.
They knew the law, they knew how it worked,
and that made them even more dangerous when they chose to break it. The Dalton Gang, formed in the early 1890s, as a loosely organized band of criminals centered around Bob,
Grat, and Emmett Dalton. They started with small-time robberies, trades, stores, and rural banks across the Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma.
Their knowledge of law enforcement helped them escape again and again.
Their boldness grew, their crimes became more ambitious, and soon, they were wanted in multiple states.
The gang's reputation swelled like a storm cloud.
They weren't just criminals, they were becoming infamous.
Newspapers began romanticizing their exploits. The public feared them, and yet some admired their daring. But for Bob Dalton, it wasn't enough.
He wanted to go out with a bang. He wanted to outdo Jesse James and rob the banks at once.
At the same time, in broad daylight, in their own hometown, Coffeyville, Kansas, was a bustling frontier town in 1892.
With a population of around 1,000,
it had grown rapidly with the arrival of the railroad.
Banks were flush with cash.
Merchants did brisk business, and the townsfolk,
many of whom knew the Daltons, had settled into a life of hard work and faith in their community.
But the Dalton brothers weren't strangers in Coffeyville.
They had grown up there,
walked those same wooden sidewalks,
played in those same dusty alleys.
Bob Dalton believed the familiarity gave him an edge.
He believed that in 10-12 minutes,
the gang could hit two banks at once. The
First National Bank and the CM Condon, and COC Bank, and vanish before anyone realized
what had happened. But he was wrong. On the morning of October 5, 1892, 5 riders quietly entered Coffeyville. Bob Dalton, Grat Dalton,
Emmett Dalton,
Bill Power, Dick Broadwell.
They wore long coats to conceal their weapons. They tied their horses in an alley near the jail, and they split into 2 teams, one for each bank.
It was a Wednesday morning. The streets were busy,
but something felt off.
A local hardware store owner, Charles D. Connolly,
spotted the gang as they passed. He noticed their rifles and unfamiliar horses. Within minutes, word spread.
The Dalton boys are back,
and they're up to no good.
Townspeople sprang into action. Shopkeepers armed themselves. Citizens ran for cover. And by the time the Daltons were inside the banks, the town was already preparing to fight. Inside the First National Bank, Grat Dalton and Bill Power forced employees to hand over cash and gold.
Simultaneously, in the Condon Bank,
Bob and Emmett Dalton held a revolver to the cashier and demanded the safe be opened, but the bank staff delayed. They stalled. They lied, claiming the time lock wouldn't open yet. It would time precious minutes that would prove fatal.
Outside, townspeople gathered behind barrels and wagons.
Several rushed into Isham's hardware store to grab rifles and pistols. Sheriff George Connolly arrived, revolver in hand.
And in a matter of minutes,
the trap was set.
As the gang exited the banks, they were met with a wall of gunfire.
Boom! The first shot rang out, and then chaos. The Dalton gang scrambled for cover.
Bullets tore through windows, signs, and flesh.
Sheriff Connolly was shot and killed. So was Lucius Baldwin, a young store clerk who tried to intervene.
Townsperson George Cubine was gunned down on the street.
Charles Brown, a cobbler, was fatally wounded by stray fire. But the townspeople pressed on. Bill Power was shot in the face and chest. Grat Dalton was hit multiple times, collapsing in the alley. Dick Broadwell took a bullet to the chest and fled on horseback. He died later from his wounds. Bob Dalton and Emmett Dalton tried to escape, using hostages as cover.
Bob was gunned down just feet from his horse.
Emmett was shot 23 times incredibly. he survived. The entire gunfight lasted just minutes, but when the smoke cleared, 4 of the 5 gang members were dead. 4 townspeople lay dead as well. The street was soaked in blood. Emmett Dalton, barely clinging to life, was pulled from the battlefield. The townspeople were furious. He had betrayed them, his own community. But instead of killing him, they arrested him. Emmett recovered slowly. He was sentenced to life in prison at the Kansas State Penitentiary. But the story didn't end there. After serving 14 years, Emmett Dalton was paroled in 1907. He moved to California, became a real estate agent, got married, and later, astonishingly, wrote books and even starred in silent films about his past. His autobiography, When the Daltons Rode, was later adapted into a Hollywood movie in 1940. Emmett lived until 1937, the last living witness of the Coffeyville raid. He claimed he was coerced into the robbery, that he never wanted to hurt anyone, that he only joined to protect his brothers. But history remains divided. Was he a misguided young man swept up in loyalty, or willing accomplice to one of the deadliest heists of the Wild West? Today, the streets of Coffeyville, Kansas, bear little resemblance to that bloody morning in 1892, but the memory lingers. The Dalton Defenders Museum stands in the heart of town. Reenactments of the shootout draw tourists and historians. Gravestones of the fallen gang and townspeople rest in Elmwood Cemetery, silent reminders of that fateful day. The site of the banks remains, and in every retelling, the townspeople of Coffeyville are hailed as heroes, ordinary men and women who stood up to crime and won. The biggest question remains, why would the Daltons attempt such a suicidal robbery? Bob Dalton was reportedly obsessed with outdoing Jesse James. He wanted to rob the banks at once and etch his name in history. Some say they were desperate, on the run, low on funds. They needed one last big score to escape west, perhaps to South America. But perhaps the most human reason of all, pride. The belief that they were smarter, faster, and luckier than the law. But on that October morning, they found out they were wrong. And so ends the story of the Dalton Gang, from lawmen to outlaws to legends. Their final raid didn't make them rich. It didn't make them escape, but it did make them unforgettable. A violent moment that crystallized the end of the outlaw era and showed that sometimes justice wears no badge, just courage. Thank you for watching Crimes Through Time. If you found this story gripping, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the darkest corners of history. What would you have done that day in Coffeyville? Until next time, stay curious, stay safe,